Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Guillermo Rodriguez. I'm the head of audience and data here at CHI, and we're really happy to welcome you to this another session of our Impact Festival. This is week 4, and as you know, we're going to continue going for another week that is packed with a lot of other really relevant and interesting sessions that we have been preparing for all of you. In the session today, we are going to be discussing enforcement and basically what we know about how it works and how it's being implemented across different places and different nations. Just a bit of housekeeping before we go into details of what we are going to be discussing today, before I introduce our panelists for the day. So first of all, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A box that you're going to see at the bottom of your screen. Also, feel free to start discussing with any of the other attendees in the chat box. Feel free to introduce yourself and share your views and comments. And also, if you're on social media, remember to use our hashtag, which is hashtag CHIFest2020. For the session of today, we have Darren Moranis, Jeff Kositsky, and Francesca Albanese, who are experts in different areas and come from really different backgrounds. And we're going to be hearing from them what we know about this really interesting topic. Just to set the scene a bit and just say a couple of words about it. We know that enforcement has been used to reduce homelessness, to reduce somehow street activity in different areas. And there's an extensive tradition that has been coming in different waves, both in Europe and in the US. We also know that there's a really emotive response in many of the cases, and that there are different normative perspectives on how this problem is actually being addressed. There are also a variety of different models of how these different aspects might be being implemented that can go all the way from basically criminalizing specific activities all the way to changes in the infrastructure and the built environment to try to nuancedly and nudge people out of specific areas. So in this session, we really wanted to start discussing and unpacking all of that different discussion, and especially listening the different perspectives that are relevant. So it would be really interesting to start with Darren. So Darren, can you please introduce yourself, say a bit more about who you are, your background, and it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on how these problems are usually approaching in our context, and really your view on your take on how this problem is being approached in the UK.
Okay, yes, thank you. And also thank you for the invitation this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to this session. I'm Darren Moranis, currently the Chief Executive of an organisation called Expert Citizens. We are a community interest company run by and for people with lived and living experience of some of the biggest social injustices of our times. And that's combinations of people experiencing homelessness, addiction, mental ill health, caught up in the criminal justice system, victims and survivors of domestic abuse and sexual abuse. We were based in Stoke-on-Trent, and but we work on a national sort of basis. All of our members and all of our staff have lived experience or living that experience still today as well. I was put into care at a very young age, at the age of 6. Really struggled to remember any more of my sort of childhood. And at first I was told it was for a short length of time. Unfortunately, that length of time was for 11 years. And I really struggled when I left that setting at the age of 17. I couldn't hold a job down. Unfortunately, I have a visual impairment and a few learning difficulties. Unfortunately, back in them days, sort of showing my age a bit, there wasn't the support, there wasn't the technology for someone like me to sort of progress really in life. At that time, my mental health was really, really deteriorating. I found myself on the streets a couple of times in my life at my early stages, and yeah, I was struggling. And to get through some of them struggles, I started heavily drinking and taking lots and lots of drugs. Unfortunately, that led me then into falling into the criminal justice system and going to prison for 4.5 years. On that release from prison, I was released from prison homeless, even though at the beginning of my prison sentence, they knew the date I was getting released from prison. I was still released from prison directly on the streets of Stoke-on-Trent at Christmas time, 2012, and it was a real difficult time. I was quite lucky. I was picked up by a couple of local charities in our area, and I was sort of given accommodation. We'll say probably wasn't the best accommodation at the time, but it was a roof. And then still battling them sort of addictions and also my mental health. I knew I didn't want to ever go back to prison again. I knew I wanted to sort of change my life somehow. I didn't know how that was going to happen. I started volunteering in a couple of local projects and really sort of found my sort of calling as such. So back in 2013, 2014, we were invited to take part in a project in Stoke-on-Trent where we were lucky and we received £10 million of lottery money, and that became the Fulfilling Lives programme, which has run over 12 areas of the UK. Back into, and then we did and volunteered many times and trying to create some sort of systems change in our local city. Back in 2016, we then decided actually that we recognised that us as people with lived experience experiencing these social disadvantages, that we had a great knowledge and we could use that knowledge to create some sort of change. So we decided to become an independent organisation of our own. We currently have 8 full-time employees and over 35 volunteers who all experience these different systems. And in my mind and the experience of some of our guys, we don't believe sort of enforcement works or it doesn't work how it should do. That many times that the enforcements work, we're just putting people into other broken systems, unfortunately, what don't work. And then over time, we keep getting all these labels and stuff added to us. And actually then trying to move on in life is a really, really difficult time, that actually all that stuff follows us about. And very often people keep concentrating, on our problems and never looking at the skills or the stuff we have. Around, I think sometimes in the UK, we create policies sometimes very much how we commission services, very much in a siloed, singular, ways that actually lots of these policies, need to be joined up to work better. And why do we create policies and procedures when we don't involve them people who they directly affect? And so for us to do that and to get to that better future we want to, we want to be involved in them sort of talks and that sort of thing. We also in our little organisation in Stoke, we also are in a Housing First partnership. So we're dealing with people directly who were affected by homelessness and some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. Thank you.
That's a really interesting perspective, Darren. And we are completely on board with the idea of co-creation and actually involving people who have lived experiences to design programs in a way that is a lot more effective and is actually considering the elements of the experiences that you have in a way that can approach them and in a way that is actually geared to tackle those barriers. So you were basically describing that these approaches do not work. And I really wanted to pick your brain on which are those elements that you felt were not working and why. Are there any specific aspects that you think we should be addressing and changing in a specific way? Or do you think that these programs flat out simply don't work? And if that is the case, why?
I mean, for me, I've seen many individuals, removed off the streets and locked up for one reason or another, if that's through begging, or if that's through antisocial behaviour and stuff like that. But, these people then are going through the revolving door of life, aren't they? We then lock them up, we criminalise them, and then we release them back onto the streets. And so that does not work, flat out doesn't work. But however, if we look looked how we can support people a bit more, and actually look what their individual needs are. Maybe we don't have to take some of these approaches. I was speaking earlier, I've just come back from outside and talking to four people who are unfortunately sleeping on the streets at the moment, and the building where they were occupying, their car park, the landlord has just called the police on them to have them physically removed from that site. And to be fair, you know, they were just sleeping there. They weren't doing anything else. And I just felt that sometimes the rough and strong tactics. However, saying that, I have seen policies and procedures where support workers have asked people to be taken into custody to give them some sort of respite sometimes off the streets. And, you know, and I can totally understand that. But people, you know, we shouldn't be in the place where people are on the streets anyway. We've just seen the biggest ever safeguarding intervention since the Second World War, where 15,000 people have been moved into hotel accommodation. We can do this, you know, when we work together and do this sort of stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think just thinking a bit more on a few of the elements that you're mentioning, of course, ensuring that we are providing support that is really well geared to ensure that people are not institutionalized somehow is one of the key aspects, and ensuring that we are approaching the needs of every specific person with a much more individualized approach that is accepting of the needs and accepting of the supports that they actually require to move on in their lives and just get off the positions in which they might be. With that in mind, I think it would be super interesting to hear the perspective of what our colleagues in the US are doing at the moment. So I would like to introduce you, Jeff. So Jeff, can you say a bit more about yourself, which is your role, which is exactly the role that you're playing in the San Francisco area, and just tell us a bit more about like how is enforcement being used in the US, and particularly in the area in which you are commissioning this type of work. And picking up on a couple of the elements that Darren is mentioning, which are those aspects that you feel are working? Which are those aspects in which you feel that we should be doing better? Are there any elements about co-creation? How are we involving people that might be living experiences in this process? And we can just take it from there.
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me. My name is Jeff Kositsky. I'm the manager of the Healthy Streets Operations Center, which I'll talk about just in a little bit. I've been working on issues of housing and homelessness for about 30 years in the United States and in Latin America, most of that with NGOs. About 4 years ago, I was asked to stand up San Francisco's first Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. Frankly, it was quite a lift getting a department off the ground in the middle of a humanitarian crisis of homelessness, and plan to go back to the nonprofit sector, but our current mayor, London Breed, asked me to stay on for another year to run this collaboration that addresses unsheltered homelessness. Just a little bit of background on San Francisco. So we've invested quite a bit in the Housing First model. We have over 10,000 units of housing and permanent rent subsidies for people experiencing homelessness. We have more per capita than any other city in the United States, and my guess is the world. We have about 4,000 shelter beds and a lot more housing and shelter beds in the pipeline. Just for some context, so San Francisco has about 22% of the San Francisco Bay Area's homeless population, but we have about 55% of the resources for people experiencing homelessness. So we invest quite a bit in the Housing First model and in permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and other programs. And as a result, while the rest of California has seen 40, 50, even 100% increases in homelessness in various cities during the past 4 years, we've seen very modest increases and in some cases decreases from year to year. However, our public has gotten incredibly frustrated, the housed public, I should say, putting a lot of pressure on elected officials In San Francisco, about 60% of our homeless population is unsheltered. And before COVID-19, that translated to about 5,000 people on the streets on any given night. The police played a major role in addressing street homelessness for about 10 years. They created a homeless outreach unit that were specially trained officers to work with people experiencing homelessness. And, you know, frankly, it did not go very well and kind of culminated with the tragic shooting and death of 2 unsheltered individuals in 2015 and in 2016. Clearly that wasn't working, and that was about the time that I started this new department. And one of the things that we did is create something called the Healthy Streets Operations Center, which is a collaboration of the police department, the fire department, the homeless department and its outreach workers, public health department, transportation departments, emergency medical services, about 8 or 9 departments all together. And rather than responding to unsheltered homelessness through the police, the idea was a services first approach, that the first encounter that a homeless person would have when a house person called to complain or when there was large encampments would be with service providers or paramedics, not with the police. And that worked very, very well. It was a good collaboration. The police really don't want to be, you know, the first responders on this stuff anyways. They were happy to take a backseat and kind of a coordinating role. And we were very, very successful for about 2 years. We saw a 30, and, you know, some of these are from a house person's perspective, success. You know, we saw a 35% reduction in complaints about homelessness, 27% reduction in the time that it took to respond. We also, in 2016, had about 1,200 tents and 42 large encampments, large being 6 or more tents. In the city. By the end of 2018, we had no large encampments in the city and about 400 tents. And also had very good outcomes with clients. I just pulled some data from one year. We encountered 1,376 clients who were in places that they quote unquote weren't supposed to be. And based on the law, I'm not saying based on my personal feelings, but there's a lot of laws in the United States and around, you know, you can't sleep here, you can't be here, you can't sit down from this time to this time during the day with sit-lie laws, no panhandling laws, and 647E, which is a no lodging in public places law. But nonetheless, when we went out to do that, we had a 65% services acceptance rate. And 58% of the clients who did accept services did not return back out onto the streets again. So, you know, certainly not perfect, but a pretty good level of engagement with clients and pretty good outcomes with those clients. So a couple things changed in 2019. This case called Martin versus Boise became sort of the law of the land, and it's stated, and I think quite smartly, that telling people that they couldn't stay in a certain place without offering them shelter or an alternative place to go was essentially a violation of their constitutional rights. So you no longer could go out to a homeless person and say, you can't be here without offering them shelter first, which the law was good, but our application of it was quite disastrous. And also shows a lot of what I have some data to back up what Darren said about how this doesn't work. So, we tracked 650 clients. So what happened is the police were given the access to shelter, essentially. They were, when they encountered people, rather than it being a homeless outreach worker, the police, if they wanted to enforce 647E, could offer people and then transport them to shelter. You know, essentially saying, I'm either going to give you a ticket or confiscate your property, or you can go to a shelter, or you can leave the area. Those are your 3 choices, offering no agency at all to the individuals they were speaking to, no real discussion. It was sort of, you know, it wasn't really, it was more of a, you know, using, I like to call it, we were basically weaponized the shelter system. So it didn't work. We tracked 650 clients that were offered shelter beds by the police. 619 returned to the streets within 7 days. Fortunately, and the other impact that had, which was really interesting, is the willingness of unsheltered people to accept engagement from anybody dropped from 85% willing to discuss and engage down to 48% with a homeless outreach worker. So we really spent like a year traumatizing unsheltered people, certainly not on purpose, but as a kind of poor reaction to Martin versus Boise. And, you know, and I will hand it to the mayor and the political establishment in San Francisco. We stopped that process because it was clear that it didn't work. And also we'll say from a housed person's perspective, it didn't work either. We saw an increase, even though we didn't see a large increase in homelessness, we saw an increase in tents, an increase in complaints. The police commission actually recommended that San Francisco Police Department stop participating in the Healthy Streets Operations Center because they felt like their officers were getting put into bad situations. So fortunately, we've regrouped in 2020. We've moved back to a services first approach. Police are playing, you know, we do work with the police. They're there when especially when we're doing large operations. We've done, like last month, did 23 large operations. The police got out of their vehicles once the entire time when a gentleman needed assistance and was having a mental health issue and needed to be, 5150'd or brought to a psychiatric hospital. Other than that, they haven't gotten out of their cars. So, you know, I feel like we're back on the right track again. And this idea of kind of coordinating through an operations center type approach in which everybody's working together and playing their roles well and dialoguing with each other rather than working in a vacuum is a good response. COVID-19 has kind of knocked us, all of us, in many ways, kind of off of our game a little bit, but we still are now, I think up and running again, having kind of been reeling a little bit for a few months. We have a lot of people staying in tents now, and we're not taking them away from folks because they are providing them the same safety my mask is providing to me. But we are, I think, effectively addressing concerns when there's sort of a poor interactions between housed and unhoused people, and have been able to address that quite well, again, through a services first approach. So I guess I'll just sum it up by saying I certainly agree with Darren that enforcement does not work. And I can tell you that 95% of the police officers in San Francisco that you spoke to will tell you exactly the same thing, that enforcement doesn't work. What works is dialogue with people and finding them the right services that they need. I mean, I think also holding people accountable for for their own behavior, not assuming that because somebody's unsheltered, they can't be a good neighbor. They can be, but sometimes need a little bit of guidance on what that means. So during COVID-19, we also put together a good education campaign for unsheltered people, kind of explaining expectations during this crisis. So I will leave it at that. And thank you very much for having me today.
I think that's a terrific summary, Jeff, and it's really interesting to hear all of those elements. Just to pick up a couple of them, I think you were making a lot of emphasis on the importance of choice and ensuring that we are not weaponizing the options that we have, just to ensure that we are just using that legislation in a way that is forcing people's hand. So I think that's a key element I'm taking out of what you're saying. I think the second element is really around coordination of services and how can we overcome those barriers of thinking in silos somehow. And it would be really interesting to hear more about what actually allowed that to happen in San Francisco. And in a related point is also the relevance of this much more joint approach to services. And you were basically describing the police force as a way of coordinating and identifying the potential needs of people. So if you can just summarize a couple of words on that, what was actually allowing San Francisco to take a much more holistic approach, coordinating all of those services?
Yeah, I think that by creating this operations center, and by the way, I want to give some props to Seattle because we stole the idea from them. They had activated their emergency operations center, which happens during a disaster like an earthquake or a global pandemic. And they were addressing homeless encampments that way. And I went up to saw, and they had a giant room with all the different departments there, all working together, watching 311 or citizen complaint lines coming in and police non-emergency calls, and then we're kind of triaging the calls and essentially say, well, we should do this too. So we activated our emergency operations center. We operate in the room where everybody would go in the event of an earthquake. We've had to relocate since then because of the pandemic. But so you've got representatives from all of these key departments sitting in a room together all day. The police's main role is both to provide security when we're out doing large operations, but also they're doing dispatching, fielding calls. A lot of them are actually staying indoors, playing more administrative roles. And then having all those departments there, say a call comes in, oh, there's a guy at the middle of Van Ness and California Street screaming on the street. Oftentimes the social worker from the homeless department will be like, oh, that's John. I know the case manager who works with him at public health. Let's call that person and get them out there right now. And police can use support in case something, things escalate. That's how we work. I just wanted to add one thing I forgot, which is, I'm relatively new working with the government. It's really been like 4 years and 60 days or so. One thing that's hard about working in the government when you do this kind of work is that, we have to respond to all people, housed and unhoused people, whether, it's what my passion or what I want to do or not. And the thing that's been good about the Healthy Streets Operations Center is that, it balances the needs of housed and unhoused people. And when it shows success, it gets the support of housed people. It's certainly not perfect. There's many people who are very much against it and don't think the police should be involved at all. And I think things are evolving around policing in the US, but probably don't have time to talk about that. So I think it's important though, for those who work for the government to understand, you can't sort of ignore, when you ignore the complaints of housed people, things are just going to escalate and then you're going to get police intervention. So rather than, disregarding complaints about people who have a tent encampment under the window and can't sleep at night, you have to be empathetic towards everybody, housed and unhoused, whether that's how you actually want to move through the world or not. And HSOC has provided that tool. And it ends up getting a lot of complaints from both housed and unhoused people because we're trying to get this middle ground. So I know we're doing something right because everybody's complaining about us, but at the end of the day, our outcomes are quite good, I think.
I think that's a really good reflection to end there. And I wanted to bring it back to the UK context and bring Francesca in to basically discuss which of these elements actually resonate with the things that we are actually seeing in our context. To what extent are we taking an approach that is coordinating these services, is not using force in whenever it's actually possible? How are we joining those services? And coming back to some of the elements that Darren was mentioning, how are we considering co-creation and the experiences of people who are actually living these conditions? So can you also say a bit more about the legal framework in this context? I think that would be relevant for the rest of the discussion. And just after we have this point from Francesca, we're going to start opening up for questions. I can see a couple of them coming already, so we'll pick on those in a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo. So I'm just going to draw on some research we did actually, which will explain the legal framework as well. So I work for Crisis, so I'm the head of research and evaluation there, and we did a piece of in-depth research actually on the use of enforcement measures in England and Wales. So I suppose that's the first point to make, is there's different legislation in Scotland than there is to England and Wales. I suppose it's important to kind of stress that. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about what the research some of the findings that came out of it, and actually a lot of it resonates with points that Darren and Jeff have made already, and then go on to talk a little bit around some of the kind of best practice work we're doing, which also kind of links in with that kind of multi-agency approach, and thinking a bit more around kind of, well, what's the alternative to enforcement? And kind of what else can we do? So there's two bits of legislation really. So the first one is the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, which came in 2014, and the second one is the Vagrancy Act, which came in 1824. So much older piece of legislation, one of the things we've been doing at Crisis is actually looking at particularly the Vagrancy Act, about whether we need it anymore. Mainly of thinking about, so if you've got this 2014 Act, which is looking at kind of elements of kind of crime and antisocial behaviour, kind of what's the purpose of the Vagrancy Act and how is it used? And we've actually been doing some joint work with the police in terms of understanding a little bit more about kind of why they use it and why it's still in place. So the research we did a few years ago now, but a lot of it still kind of is relevant. We actually did some of the work through a peer research element actually. So it was people who had experienced rough sleeping themselves who kind of helped us with the data collection. And what we found that was, I think, very important to stress is that there's kind of formal enforcement measures which come under the kind of legislative framework. So things like criminal behaviour orders, about kind of public space protection orders in terms of legal frameworks about particular areas, often applied to town centres or particular areas. There's quite formal measures that are used, but actually there's a lot of informal enforcement measures that get used. And I think it's quite important to stress that, because when we did our research, what we found is that the informal measures get used more. And what I'm talking about there is kind of the police moving people on, kind of things like, you know, we saw cases of intentional use of noise pollution to stop people sleeping rough in areas. And we'd also, at the time, there'd been a kind of particular increase in what's called defensive architecture, where town centres, city centres are designing people out. So they can't sleep rough, they can't kind of congregate. And I think one of the things, I suppose, what we were trying to look at is kind of why they were being used and kind of what the impact was. And I think, you know, it's kind of been mentioned already, but there are clear drivers for use of enforcement. You know, a lot of the time it's about public pressure. We found that, so we did interviews with the local authorities and the police, as well as with people who were homeless themselves. And what we found is that often it was about public pressure. It might have been from local businesses as well, because, you know, as Jeff mentioned, you can't ignore these views. You know, it's also what we found was we were trying to sort of disentangle kind of the use of enforcement measures for antisocial behaviour and begging, and the use of enforcement measures for rough sleeping and homelessness, and trying to understand a little bit more about kind of why they were used in different contexts. And I think what we found is that quite often there was more enforcement measures used to tackling general antisocial behaviour than to tackling rough sleeping, but they still were being used to tackle rough sleeping. And so the most common ones we came across in terms of, we spoke to about 500 people who had been rough sleeping in the last 12 months when we'd done the research. So we saw use of dispersal orders, and we also saw use of criminal behaviour orders within kind of different contexts. And I think one of the things that came through, it was very geographically different. And I think this comes on to, obviously, you know, a particular kind of local powers or local political agendas. So what we found is we did sort of 3 case study areas and looked at them in quite intensely, and they were actually applying enforcement measures in very different ways. And so the drivers of those enforcement measures were quite different, and therefore the impact was quite different. And I suppose just sort of moving through into some of the kind of things that we found when we were actually talking to people is that what I think one of the things that really struck us was there was quite a difference between people that received support as a result of enforcement and those that didn't. So where support was offered, and that was things like signposting to homelessness organisations or access to emergency accommodation, of those people that were offered support, 60% of them took it up, whereas actually quite a lot of people didn't receive the support. And I think that's the big kind of difference in terms of how you look at this issue as well. And I think the other thing just to think about was also kind of the impact of displacement. So I mentioned before that actually we came across a lot of use of informal enforcement and a lot of kind of moving people on. And what people said is that they, you know, it didn't solve their problem. They were still homeless, but what a lot of the time what it did is it actually moved them away from services. So if we're being forced into other areas, that it kind of didn't really solve the issue. It just moved it into somebody else's responsibility, and those individuals still needed help. I think what we looked at, we had very little examples actually of people where formal enforcement measures had been given and then that led to kind of positive change. Where it did, it was where someone had been given kind of a support package, and that was kind of access to proper social support. There was an example of somebody we spoke to who had quite severe mental health needs, and actually one of the reasons why the enforcement was used in that particular case was because they'd got to the point where the outreach workers didn't know what else to do. And I'm not necessarily agreeing with that as a response, but I'm just saying that it gives an example of kind of where it has been used. I think one of the things we're finding though, and it's been quite interesting because we've actually looked at as part of the current past few months, because we're doing some research with local authorities, and we've kind of been looking at the issue of enforcement came up. And interestingly, what local authorities are saying is that in the past few months, it's been a lot easier for them to form multi-agency partnerships with different actors. And because of the pandemic and because of the pressures and because, it's a public health emergency, we've seen very drastic but important measures being put in terms of getting people off the streets. And what that's actually done is enforcement measures haven't had to be used. So we've seen very few examples of that being the case. And, that's because people are being offered accommodation they want to go inside for. And I think that's a really important point, that when we did the research a few years ago, and I did quite a lot of the interviews myself, I remember somebody saying to me, well, we were offered, essentially they were a lot of the time they were given a single service offer. So it was basically take this emergency, it was often things like a no second night out hub, or something that was, they didn't want to go in for that, they didn't want to be in a communal space with other people. So it's also thinking a bit around what is it that we want, if we're able to give people a genuine support and housing offer where they can then engage with services and we can work with people, then that's a much better outcome than using enforcement measures. And I suppose I'll just finish up on a couple of points, because I know some of them will be picked up in the questions anyway. But I think one of the things we're genuinely trying to do at the moment is think about alternatives to enforcement. So when we started looking at the Vagrancy Act in particular, we engaged with the police a lot, and different police forces, and we're very aware that, and this came through in the research as well, like police forces are under pressure for different reasons. And the other thing being is that a lot of when we did some interviews of people working, kind of working in particular areas, what a lot of people working in the police who we interviewed said is they weren't aware of what homelessness services were available in their local area. They didn't actually know where to refer people, and they didn't know what support was available. So if they're not aware of that, it's then very difficult to engage with it. So I think a lot of where we saw good practice, and we have seen good practice, is that kind of multi-agency working where there is a kind of community safety team. The community safety team is genuinely wanting to engage with people and think about kind of alternative solutions, and that there's a lot of information sharing. So going back to what Darren was saying at the beginning around, kind of services working in silos, I think this is a real case where if those silos are broken down and there's access to accommodation, support, drug and alcohol, kind of actual genuine kind of rehabilitation, kind of those types of services, you generally get kind of better outcomes for people, and it is better for the individual. And I think one of the things we've talked a lot around is choice, and I think it is also around kind of really understanding what somebody's individual choices. And I think one of the things that's come out when we've been doing the work on, particularly on the Vagrancy Act, and thinking around kind of best practice solutions, is that quite often we're talking about people who may have gone through trauma previously, whether that's at the moment or earlier on in life, and actually you need to kind of then think about trauma-informed care and support. And that's kind of part of this solution as well. And, you know, I think there's very little room for enforcement being used. Personally, I don't think there is a place for enforcement, and I think there's always alternatives to enforcement. I think, you know, especially on when we're talking about rough sleeping, you know, it isn't it's not necessary, and there are other ways of tackling it.
Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there on how the different pressures might be playing along, and how the different approaches might be actually defined by the characteristics of different areas, and how we might require different approaches for different people. And that actually resonates with a couple of the points. And I just wanted to start asking you a few other questions. So on the topic of choice, Phil Warren is asking a question around whether is there any space for more protective enforcement, such as basically enforcing movement into shelters and supported accommodation during adverse weather? And I think that would be an interesting question for Jeff and also for Darren, especially given that you were basically saying that the laws, especially in San Francisco, had been weaponized somehow to reduce that choice. So are there any conditions in which you feel that there's some space to be moving people for protective reasons? Jeff, Darren, would you mind starting, Jeff?
Sure. I don't think forcing people to go into shelters is a very effective way to assist people. And however, I do think there's cases in which people, due to behavioral health issues, have become unable to care for themselves on the streets and need to be conserved. And in San Francisco, in my opinion, we've been much too lax in this area and allow people to suffer on the streets in ways that are quite horrifying, actually, and have recently started kind of tightening up the law, saying that we're able to conserve people more easily and essentially start making choices for them after they've been in the psychiatric emergency room, I think 8 times during a given year, in order to so I think there probably are some cases, but I think when people are able, and I think the vast majority of people on the streets are able to make clear decisions for themselves, taking that choice away from them really doesn't do any. It may help that night, or you may think that it's helping that night, but in the long run, it's not an effective way to use a shelter system. I will also say, however, I live in a city where the chance of dying from hypothermia or from heat stroke is very, very, very low. So my perspective is maybe a little bit different from people who live in, states like New York, where, people can freeze to death on the streets quite easily.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I wanted to move to Darren and start asking you about, like, are there some cases in which we might have people that are actually not engaging with services for whatever reason? And it would be really interesting to understand which you think are, in your perspective and the people that you know, those reasons why they might not be engaging, and what can be actually done to support them to actually take up these services.
Yeah, so, engagement, funny old word, isn't it? We would never say we were going to engage with our family members or anything. It's a funny word. For me, it's about them individual offers. If that person is not engaging with that system, and when do we say it's not engagement? Because they've missed an appointment, but that person's still sitting behind that desk waiting for the next person to miss their appointment. So for me, it's about getting the offer right for that individual, and very much like Jeff just said, forcing people into an emergency night shelter in winter when they may have had a bad experience in a communal night shelter or something like that, it is not the way forward. It's about getting them individual offers with that wraparound individual support for the person who needs it at that time, and giving people choices, choice.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of choice and awareness, because the reality is that by reducing the choice that people might have, we might not we might fail to be aware of all of the other circumstances that might be defining why you don't really want to be moving into a shelter. You might have had a terrible experience of whatever happened in the past that is conditioning your decision of not going there, and that's a completely rational choice. So I think it's of course a really tricky trade-off to identify.
But, yeah, and then we move them in because it's severe weather. But 2 days later, when it's warmed up a bit, we kick them straight back on the streets. How does that work? How does that work for anybody?
Absolutely. So there's another really interesting question from an anonymous attendee that didn't want to reveal their name, but that's absolutely fine. And this is a tricky one because what can be done about those who are like much more persistent in antisocial behaviors, and how can we create those differential treatments somehow into those that are just sleeping rough for whatever reason, and those that are engaging in antisocial behavior. So Francesca, you were mentioning a bit about what your research was saying about that. So do you mind saying a bit more, please?
No, that's a hard question. Thank you. I mean, I think, I think that there's two things. I think one of the things when we did do the research, there was quite different approaches. So one of the areas we did a case study with actually had kind of a yellow card, red card system, which I'm sure may have, other people may be familiar with, where it was kind of, they were trying to kind of engage with an individual and actually kind of it was a kind of, 3 strikes and you're out sort of mechanism. Now, I don't agree with that, because I don't think it's particularly helpful in terms of how you engage with somebody. But the reason why they were doing it is they were trying to, I think, engage with somebody, give them sort of say, we would normally prosecute you for antisocial behaviour at this point, but we don't want to do that. We actually want you to try and engage with, a drug or alcohol rehabilitation usually, and therefore, we're gonna help you do that. And then, but if you continue to perpetrate antisocial behaviour, then that, at some point you are going to be arrested. But I think the thing there is that, you will then still always arrest, if that gets to the point, you will then still engaging that person in the criminal justice system. And Darren sort of made the point earlier, is that necessarily the right outcome for them? I think the other area where I think one of the things that's quite interesting is if you did, thinking about separating out kind of genuine antisocial behaviour and then people who are rough sleeping and often are being kind of prosecuted or used enforcement measures because of that circumstances, then I think you can then start to think a little bit more about kind of, are there more targeted approaches to that individual? But the thing is, I know one of the things that came out of our research, and I know it's also kind of relevant at the moment in terms of England anyway, is a real lack of drug and alcohol services, and there's been a real decline in England anyway over the last sort of 10 years. And what that means is that actually it's really difficult to then get some, if the sort of, if the services aren't there, if somebody's having to travel far to actually engage with something like that, then that's also not great either. So I think for me, it's also about, you need to invest more. If you're going to talk, if you're going to think about how to engage with an individual, you kind of need the support services there. So there's a genuine offer before you start thinking about, taking more kind of sort of formal measures around enforcement, particularly to do with kind of drug use.
Jeff, I also want to pick your brain on that specific point. And what do you think, in your opinion, and given your experience, are those much more targeted approaches that could be used when you have these more sustained cases?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we should be doing is not making the things worse. I don't like this, people like to say service resistant. I don't know if they say that in the UK, but in the US, it's often bandied about people are service resistant. And that may or may not be true, but what I do know is that the more you force people or use services as a way to control people's behavior and take away their agency, if they weren't resistant before, they're going to become resistant. It's like having a boss who, is constantly yelling at you to do something without explanation and just expecting you to jump when your boss says how high. Like most of us will develop sort of a callus, an emotional callus around that, and learn how to resist that kind of abusive behavior by either not doing the work or not doing it well or quitting and finding another job. And people on the streets, like I shared some data, we actually made people become more service resistant by using the police as the as frontline responders without giving the police actual tools to be good frontline responders. And it made and we did some research with some anthropologists, and a lot of people started becoming more and more anxious, and the more anxious they become, the much harder it is for outreach workers or social workers to find out how to assist those folks. So that's one thing is don't make it worse by trying to weaponize social services. The second thing, and this is, we have found though about 15% of the people we engage with or try to work with do not want to engage. And like whoever wrote that, people who are just persistent perpetrator, I don't know what ASB is, but people who are flatly refusing to engage with services. And what we started doing, but we had to put a pin in it, is this is just about like the reality of our work, is we have homeless outreach workers who are extraordinary human beings. Many have lived experience, but they also aren't necessarily, well-trained in just well-trained, period. So we have to try to give them the tools. And what we were working on is to kind of come up with a typology of need, if you will, or people who, that these are the 4 kinds of folks who persistently will say no. These are the reasons why, and these are the tools that we think will help motivate them to give our outreach workers and police or whomever much better and clearer training and tools on how to address those folks. Because sometimes people will say to me, well, that's just a bike chop shop. That person's a criminal. That's one of the people who don't want to accept services because they're criminals. And however you want to judge that, but the bottom line is, but there they are on the street. So, and they're not going to get arrested. And if they do, they're going to be out of jail within 24 hours. So rather than having this attitude of, kind of labeling them as service resistant, we should just think about, well, we're missing something. There's got to be something that we can do to engage those folks in a different way. And we were, I guess, working with UCSF, University of California at San Francisco Medical School to try to come up with this, but they've paused the work. But I've done some, initial research and some ethnographic studies, I guess they call them. And but I think the reality of it is we have to train the folks who are doing this work much better than we do. We kind of rely on their hearts and in some cases their lived experience, and that carries people 90% of the way. But I think we need to provide people better training to address the problem.
Absolutely, that resonates a lot, and it's really about how can we ensure that we are living in a much more compassionate society that is actually identifying those potential overlaps between social policy and criminal policy in a way that can be potentially interlinked, and how can we tackle those barriers. So Darren, just reflecting on what Jeff is saying, are there like any specific recommendations? Are there like things that you would have liked whenever you were approached by someone who was doing outreach work that would have made a difference? Which are those key elements that are, in your opinion, crucial to ensure that people actually engage and served in a way that is appropriate for their support that they require? Like
I've had quite a number of support workers over the years, to be honest with you, and I really connected with one person a number of years ago who really helped me, and that was because she didn't look at my past, and actually she didn't judge me, and actually she gave me a hug and it's a big no-no in this work, but actually that I needed that at that time, and we're still friends today, you know, and we do work together today as stuff. So that was really, really important. It was treating me like a human being and not like a problem. Going back to some of Jeff's stuff around some extra training needed for frontline workers, you know, we had the Care Act, we got the Mental Capacity Act, the Mental Health Act. But how many frontline workers, and I know there's been a lot of work going on over the last couple of years, but how many frontline workers know the full knowledge how to use them in the correct way? And we need to invest more in our frontline outreach sort of staff. Antisocial behaviour, it's always baffled me sometimes when we try and you know, say that about rough sleepers, but it's okay on a Friday, Saturday night in your town centres for hundreds of people to be totally doing that sort of stuff because they're putting money into the economy. It seems to be okay, but there's so much more antisocial behaviour in the nighttime economy than there ever is from people who are living on the streets.
So I think I'm getting a lot of relevant elements, and just as a way of trying to summarize them, I think that there's crucially a component around co-creation and really understanding which are the needs of people, ensuring that we have a much more holistic approach that is like coordinating the relevant services and putting the services first, and enforcement as a different element, not the main aspect that we are using to engage with people. I think that there's clearly an element around choice and training and ensuring that we are approaching people based on their needs and the support that they require. Are there any other aspects? And I'll just give a couple of minutes to each of you to say, which is, in your opinion, that top tip, that top aspect that we should be looking at if we are going to make enforcement and all of these approaches more effective in the future? Which is that thing that you would definitely change? Francesca, would you mind starting? So I don't put you in a spot again in the hardest position.
I mean, I was thinking actually, whilst we've talked about housing first, quite like at the beginning, and I actually think enforcement's the polar opposite of that. So my takeaway comment is we need to employ more of the principles, so harm reduction, non-coercion, and choice, and control within kind of services, but actually the enforcement really, there is always an alternative to enforcement, and it should only ever be a very last final resort.
Jeff?
I will just take a moment to, I think, to answer a question that keeps coming up, and somebody typed it in there about overcoming this issue of not having enough access to resources if you're an outreach worker, which is like very, very true. And I would just wanted to say, you know, two things about that. One is, one of the things about coordinating through the Healthy Streets Operations Center is that we've got everybody who's got those resources all in a room together, so we can in real time get access to a treatment bed or a shelter bed or what might be needed. But the reality of it is we're never going to have, well, I shouldn't say never. Right now in the US, I don't see a path forward where we're going to have enough resources to really address the problems the way we should. But it doesn't mean that the outreach worker and their role in this isn't critical. And to also remember that, you know, a loving and genuine conversation with another human being, you know, is something that many people on the streets, at least here in San Francisco, are lacking. And then how do you leverage that relationship that you're building? If you don't have what you need today, you might have it tomorrow. That's not a great and satisfactory answer for any of us, but it is sort of the reality that we have to deal with. But I would say being able to coordinate those resources to make sure your outreach workers at least have some tools available to them every day is critical and has been really effective here in San Francisco, I think.
Darren?
I've got a massive list. No, I'm only kidding. You know, very much what I think is also, you know, touching on the housing first stuff. You know, we know this works for a great number of people. However, we love doing the pilot in this country, even though the pilot works. Not very often that pilot continues. you know, I've just looked through what's happening within the pandemic, and there's been some amazing partnerships formed with different services working together. How sustainable that is, I'm not too sure with how our commissioning process is set up in the UK. Very much a competition sort of thing, but also looking how long services are commissioned for. You know, if a local authority is commissioning for waste removal, that can get commissioned up to 15 for 20 years. But often homeless services get commissioned for 3 years, and that it's not work. It doesn't work.
Or even less than that. And that's actually a comment that we receive in many cases, is around sustainability. How can we ensure that the resources are going to be there and available, so we can start planning in the longer term to ensure that that coordination actually happens. Absolutely agree. I really hope that all of you found this as illuminating as I did, really interesting, and really appreciate having all of these different views. And particularly, I think that we found an agreement that there are some key elements that are absolutely fundamental when tackling these problems, and those seem to resonate across the pond, which is also really interesting to hear in this context. So it was absolutely brilliant to have you all. Thank you to all of our panelists. And
Thank you.
to all of our attendees, remember that we still have one whole week of sessions coming. So go into the website and have a look at all of the other details, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.